right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are going to be talking about letters to the editor this evening, specifically related to our work to pass the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act. But the LTE training specifically will be applicable to any advocacy work that you do. And so hopefully this will be helpful in lots of different ways. This evening, we will do a quick welcome and introductions. I'll introduce my co-facilitator, and then Amy will lead us through an overview of the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act so that you can learn about the policy that we're advocating for. I will then talk through how to write an LTE. We'll have some writing time so that you can put pen to paper. And then we'll wrap up with a reflection and next steps. And like I said, any questions that you have. So I would invite folks to introduce themselves in the chat. You can add your name, your pronouns, where you're calling in from, and then thought it would be interesting to see how folks usually get around your community on a daily basis, since we're talking about all things transportation this evening. So I'll give you all a moment to do that. And then I will just offer a quick introduction and then hand it off to Amy. My name is Hannah. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from Chicago. I'm the Climate Communications Manager at the Illinois Environmental Council, which I will share more about briefly. And I'm joined tonight by my colleague at the Active Transportation Alliance, Amy. Do you want to share an introduction?
Yep. Hi, everybody. Amy Reinell. I'm the Executive Director of the Active Transportation Alliance, and I'm calling in from my attic, which is very windy. So if you hear disturbing noises, it's just because it's a very old house, and I'm very close to the outside. And I love getting around by foot, bike, or train, and then bus if I need to.
Thanks, Amy. And seeing some intros in the chat. Thanks for sharing, everyone. Agree, Laura, driving is least favorite option. I try not to sit behind the wheel of a vehicle. Makes me too anxious. Some CTA users, bikers, love that. Awesome. I will just move us quickly through a background about IEC. So as I said, I'm the Climate Communications Manager here at IEC. IEC has existed since 1975, but we have grown substantially in the last decade. And as folks on this call might know, our mission is to build power for people in the environment. And we represent over 150 organizations, enviro organizations across the state. To do that. And so we work together as we convene those organizations, and we all work together to ideally advance policies that create healthy environments across all of Illinois. And we do that through a few different arenas. We do education, we do coalition building, and we do policy advocacy work. We do that work in a number of different issue areas, the 6 that you see on the screen. I'm excited to have many folks here tonight who are excited about our equitable transportation issue area, and want to note too that by being here tonight, you are essentially doing all of the pieces of our approach to this work. I know there's some folks within the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition that are joining us this evening, so you're checking off our coalition building approach. And ideally, by writing letters to the editor and advocating for the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act, we're also doing policy advocacy, and hopefully some legislators will read our LTEs and therefore be educated. So thank you for being here and for being committed to the work. I will pass it to Amy to talk through what the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act is. And Amy, if you just want to signal when you want me to move your slides, I will do that.
Sounds good. Can you all hear me okay? I don't know if you shook your heads. Okay. So the Clean and Equitable Transportation Campaign started, I'd say, about 2 years ago, and was developed from our years of work at Active Transportation Alliance, fighting to get sustainable transportation to be a much more central part of our transportation system and our climate response. So we've been working with the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, and I get to co-chair the campaign with IEC. So it is a lovely marriage of advocacy groups working together to really turn the tide on transportation. So why are we doing this? Probably next slide. Yeah. Illinois, there's so much good about Illinois, but one of the things that's not good is our air quality and the amount of GHGs that we have being generated by transportation. Next slide. So we have spent a lot of time as a state focusing on cleaning up our energy sector and our industry, but we haven't spent time on what is the number one source of GHG emissions in Illinois, which is transportation. And not only is it the number one source, it is the one source that has been growing over time. So we keep getting worse, despite the fact that we're seeing an uptick in people getting electric vehicles, despite the fact that fuels are cleaner and more efficient, we are still continuing to worsen the amount of climate harms we're doing from transportation. And that kind of overlays with the second problem faced in Illinois, which came up in the chat answers you all just gave. We need more choices for folks that are affordable and equitable and sustainable to get around. There are communities where you will likely always need a car, but there are ways to make that car cleaner, for example. There are communities where we could add a bus route that could be game changing, or a train line. A lot of people want to bike or walk places, but they don't feel safe for good reasons. But that's not the type of infrastructure that's a priority in Illinois policy. Next slide. We, as I mentioned, we have a lot of indistinction here in terms of air quality, in terms of pollution. This study is so troubling. This showed that the south and west sides of Chicago and around the St. Louis metro area, including East St. Louis, Granite City, Belleville, a few others, are some of the most polluted places in the nation. And these are high density residential areas where people are sitting out on their porch every night, where people are going to the park and playing basketball and doing other things, breathing some of the worst air in our country. And when you map out transportation, primarily highways along that, you can see a direct correlation with transportation. This is being compounded by the fact that our transit system is really struggling. And this slide is showing you, in particular, Northeastern Illinois. So I'm just going to talk about Northeastern Illinois transit for a second. It has been in crisis for quite a while, and COVID exacerbated it. So what you're seeing here is that light blue line is how our bus service has dropped over the last 15 years. We've lost about a third of our bus service due to cuts in funding or not having enough funding, and decisions made by our elected officials. We obviously had a big drop related to COVID, but a lot of that drop started before COVID. And some of this is related to rideshare agencies that have taken some folks off of transit, and that is a really inefficient use of our roadways. So a lot of compounding things happening with transit, both with service not meeting people's needs and a really really big financial crisis that's about to hit the system next year. So as we worked as a coalition across all different stakeholder and interest groups, we landed on a really robust campaign to bring Illinois into the future on transportation. Next slide, please. So we introduced the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act, and it's a package of 3 different laws that would reduce GHG emissions from transportation and get us to net zero by 2050, and would increase equitable and affordable transportation options for folks across the state. So it has 3 different legs of its stool: robust transit, investing in safety around active modes of transportation, and really pushing forth the adoption of clean cars and clean trucks. Next slide, please. So each of those buckets has its own name. The transit bill is called the Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act. The setting a GHG target so that we can drive investments into cleaner transportation is called the Transportation Choices Act. And then the last one that includes our clean vehicles is our Zero Emission Vehicle Act. So they all kind of say what they do. This is really important, really ambitious. We have a lot of community members who have for years put up with bad air and bad transportation, who are really ready for something new, and a lot of advocates who are really ready to fight for this. But we need more people. So that's why Hannah's brought us together today, to make our drumbeat louder, and to reach more people.
Thanks, Amy. And I
What did I miss?
Yeah, no, you are awesome. But I wanted to pause and see if there's any questions at this point before we move into our next part of the training. And feel free to add questions in the chat as well.
Hi, so we can just ask some questions over
please do.
the camera here. Thanks, Amy. I have a question just about this legislation, which would be, like, so in Chicago, for instance, where we have city funded transit and then a regional transportation authority, right? For municipalities like that, is the idea to sort of add supplemental funding to kind of come up with budget shortfalls for someone like Chicago? Or is it focused a lot on, adding transit options to places like East St. Louis, adding transit options to places like Galena,
Yeah. So
I'm not really familiar with it.
Wait a minute. Is Galena in Illinois? Is Galena in Illinois? Yes.
Yeah.
It's near Wisconsin. I feel like I've been there, but I can't.
I think it's the northwest, right? I think.
Yeah. Okay. So the transit bill itself does a few different things. One is it proposes making the Chicago region's transit system a regional transit system. Right now it's 4 different agencies, 4 different boards, 4 different sets of requirements, all sorts of things happening that are not working for the rider who needs to get from, the Austin neighborhood of Chicago over to, let's say, Forest Park, which is not that far away, but there isn't a direct bus, or for folks on the south side of Chicago, who are taking jobs at our job growth areas in the south suburbs, but we have really bad bus and train service for the second and third shift. So instead of viewing these little pockets of different types of agencies by geography, it's saying, let's make a regional system, unify it, and then give it a lot more money so it can do what our region needs it to do. So that's what the transit bill does, but it does a few other things to benefit transit outside of the Chicago region. But that's the transit system in crisis. The other transit systems in Illinois get a lot more money from the state. And they also can get rural transit money from the federal government. The Chicago region can't access that money. It does get some money from the state, about 17% of its operating money comes from the state, whereas the other transit systems get about 65% of their operating money from the state. So they're not treated the same at all through the policymaking. So there's stuff in there that would benefit the other transit agencies. We have asked them how much money they need, and they haven't come up with what they want added to the bill yet. But they know, because we've been asking them for a year, that like there's a lot of interest. In the Transportation Choices Act, that's really where we can unlock potential for smaller cities and rural communities and get some of those sidewalks built. I think someone may have put that in the chat. We work with communities across Illinois. We do a lot of walking audits and studies to help people get a sidewalk to their downtown or to their school or to their grocery store, because a lot of people would prefer to walk, and we just haven't built that. So we can talk about that later, but there's just a lot of opportunity through this whole package to unlock transportation choices.
Cool, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna reshare my screen. All right, are we back?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So like Amy said, we are all here this evening to figure out how we can hopefully be the bottom half of this graphic. I will disclose that at the start of my career, I was a political organizer. So my background is in doing this. And one of the things that I think about a lot is like, you know, we think about the policies that Amy just described, and it's easy to think like, why would we not pass this? Like, this seems like so obvious. Who doesn't want better access to sidewalk infrastructure? Who doesn't want to be able to bike safely through their community, right? But we know that it unfortunately is still always a fight to pass legislation. And so we need to be organized and we need to be on message in order to target and put pressure on the right decision makers. And so that's what we're here to do this evening. So thank you for being here, for joining us for this conversation. I'm going to spend some time talking about how to write an LTE. So first, just want to ground us in what exactly is an LTE. LTE stands for letter to the editor, and it's very much exactly like what the title describes. So oftentimes LTEs are written in response to an article or other opinion piece that a newspaper has already printed. So that's sort of where this term comes from, is the reader is literally writing a letter to the editor of a newspaper in response to something that they have already read. So oftentimes a reader will be reacting to an article, and sometimes a reader will submit a letter to the editor reacting to news that maybe hasn't been written about yet in the paper. And I like to think about LTEs as a way to communicate both with newspapers themselves and with other members of the public. And it's really the general public's way of being the reporter in some ways, and using your own personal voice to reach ideally large swaths of people. So I just wanted to share some examples of LTE headlines that have been published in recent months, so that you can see some examples here. The first and the third ones are maybe on our side, shall we say, and this middle one you'll see says, merging Chicago area public transit agencies has drawbacks. That LTE was written by the RTA chair, who is in opposition to the Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act. So as you can see, people on both sides of arguments and on both sides of policies write LTEs and submit them to papers, which is why we need ideally to be able to essentially deploy people like all of you to write LTEs, talking about why you think merging Chicago area public transit is a good idea and the benefits that it will bring all Illinoisans. And so I will also later, when I stop sharing my screen, share the links to some of these in the chat, because I think it's helpful to read examples as well. So I will plug those in just a bit. But next, just wanted to comment quickly on why it's helpful to write LTEs. It's actually the second most widely read section of a newspaper after the front page. I think that's likely because human interest is interesting to people. It's called human interest for a reason, right? And oftentimes people like reading things that their neighbors have to say. I always get a kick out of seeing names that I recognize in the paper as opposed to, a journalist that I maybe have no connection to. And hearing straight from my friends and neighbors, their opinions and their lived experiences, which is another reason why writing LTEs is so helpful. It's our way as activists and advocates in our own communities and in Illinois more broadly to raise our voices about issues that we care about and relate those issues to our personal stories and why they matter to us. So we'll talk about this in a bit, but this is one thing to always keep in mind when writing an LTE, which is why people should listen to you and your opinion as it relates to the issue that you're writing about. So one of the LTEs that I will share in the chat that is so great is from Bruce Mainzer. He is a Climate Reality Project activist, and he previously he was a transportation planner with the RTA when it was first established in the 70s. So he has direct experience with the transportation agencies in Chicago that are part of these negotiations and that are going to be impacted by the policies that we hopefully pass in the spring legislative session. And so he grounded his LTE in his personal experience, having worked with and for the RTA. So he's a voice that we hopefully should listen to and hopefully will prompt other members of the public to listen to as well. The other reason that they're so helpful is because they can be very, very timely. So like I said, a lot of times people will write LTEs in response to an article that has been published. And in that way, it's a way to very quickly react to the news. And so it's essentially like issuing a response to the news itself, which is often really helpful because policy moves so quickly and because the legislative cycle moves so quickly. It's a way for us to get our voice out there as quickly as possible when those quick updates are happening in the legislative session or just in the news cycle, which, as we know, also moves very quickly. And then lastly, it's a great way to center people. So oftentimes journalists will, be writing about these broad policies or be writing about these things that are going to impact real Illinoisans. And it's a way for us to center ourselves in these arguments and in these narratives and talk about how I, as an Illinoisan, or I, as a Chicagoan, will be impacted by the MMA, for example. And so it's lending our voices to the movement in a way that other people will likely be able to relate to because it's personal. So the building blocks of an LTE, they're honestly simpler than I think some people think, which is great news for us. I like to think of them in 3 segments. So clearly referencing the article or the issue in the news that you are responding to. So it's clear right off the bat what stance you're taking. And then concisely stating your opinion in response to that article or to that news, and providing evidence and that personal story that we've talked about to back up that opinion that you're asserting. We always need and want to conclude an LTE with a really clear call to action. And I say name names here because it's really important to call attention to your legislators or the decision makers who you want to be reading the LTE itself, or be paying attention to the news. One of the things that's, I think, just helpful to know across the board with communications work is that almost all legislative offices track press clips and track when the legislator that they work for is mentioned in the news. And that includes when they're mentioned in LTEs or other opinion pieces like op-eds and whatnot. And so there's lots of different ways to get the attention of your legislator. You can tweet at them, you can call their office directly. But I think an often forgotten about way is to literally call them to action in the Chicago Tribune, for example. That's another source that they pay attention to. All legislators want to be talked about positively in the news, right? And so calling attention to an issue that you care about and urging your legislator to support it in this public of a way is a really powerful tool for us as communicators and as organizers. And then I just have a few tips listed here too that are helpful to keep in mind as you're working on your LTE. The first is that a lot of papers will have explicit instructions or requirements for LTEs that you submit. That can include a word limit. So some will have, a requirement that LTEs not be more than 250 words. A lot of papers will request that you include your contact information. That's more for verification than anything else. Oftentimes the editor will reach out to you if they decide to publish your LTE to basically confirm. It's sort of the LTE way of submitting like a CAPTCHA response on a website to confirm that you're a real person. So make sure that you're including whatever contact information the paper requests of you when you submit that LTE. Like I said, referring to the decision maker that you're trying to influence by name. Hopefully that'll catch the attention of a legislative aide or constituent services person in their office, and they will track that their constituents are calling them to action in the local paper. And then, like I said, with the example from Bruce, sharing your expertise is really helpful, and grounding your LTE and why you are the right person to be commenting on an issue is really helpful. And that can be something like, Bruce having that experience with the RTA, or it can be something as simple as why you as a parent of young children want to have safe streets so that their children can get to school and walk on sidewalks or bike to school without any fear, and have that option to make sure our streets are cleaner, our air is cleaner, and they're safe, and have that option. And then just a note here too, to make sure you're writing the letter in your own words. So this is just a reminder of, this is your personal story, and so your words should be personal as well. It's just a general note that, like, the more unique or individual you can be, the more likely the paper will publish it, because they want to showcase various opinions and they want to showcase different voices and diverse voices. So make sure you're speaking from the heart. I wanted to move on to some key messaging on CETA that can be helpful as you're thinking about writing an LTE. But before I do that, just want to pause again and see if folks have any questions about sort of those building blocks of LTEs or anything else we've gone over so far. Zach, I just saw your comment. Yes, like a curated comment section. That's a good way to put it. Awesome. Okay. I will go over our key messaging. So you heard some of this because Amy is a great spokesperson. And so she automatically incorporates this when she talks about the overview of CETA, but wanted to call attention to some messages that we've specifically tested. And on the next slide, I have some key words and phrases that test really well as well. So when I say that, I am referring to, we've done some polling to figure out what are, the messages that land best with folks, whether that's members of the general public or decision makers and our targets themselves. So these are messages that we have tested and will continue to iterate on as we advocate for these policies, but thought it would be helpful to share some sort of just broad strokes ideas about the things that are most impactful for people to hear. So the first is honestly sort of like our top line message related to the Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act, which is that transit bill that Amy mentioned. So this one is the one that's most specific to the Northeastern Illinois Transit Agencies. That's the MMA. But the message here is the days of ghost buses, multiple transfers, and inequitable service must end. Chicagoans need reliable, affordable, and frequent access to transportation that connects them to opportunities, amenities, and thriving communities. And like I said, we'll talk this through on the next slide, but there's some key words and phrases in here, even in these two sentences alone, that test really well. So the word connection and thriving communities, connecting people to the things that make our communities thrive and make our communities, the ideally vibrant spaces that we want them to be, is a thing that all Chicagoans and hopefully all Illinoisans can relate to as well. We all deserve that access. We all deserve that hopefully easy access to the ways in which the things that help make our communities thrive. So it's super relatable, which is a message that everyone can understand in some way. This next one here is related to a couple of the pieces of legislation and can be used broadly, but one of the issues that tests really well and is sort of a key fact across all three of those policies within the package that is CETA, which is health. So, everyone cares about their individual health, their family's health, their community's health. And the evidence is really clear on this. Reducing our reliance on personal vehicles makes our air cleaner to breathe. When we're decreasing congestion, when we are getting people on public transit instead of using those vehicles that create massive transportation pollution, and as Amy mentioned, are so inequitable across the state, not just in Chicago. We saw that map of the Metro East area as well. Our communities are healthier. Our air is cleaner to breathe for us, for our children, for the generations to come. And that really resonates with lots of communities. The third piece here, I want to call specific attention to the phrase phasing out. So Amy mentioned one of the three bills is our Zero Emissions Vehicle Act, and that works to transition Illinois away from diesel vehicles to clean vehicles like electric vehicles. But some of the messaging around electric vehicles is tricky. We've identified that it is a fairly polarizing issue, unfortunately. And so one of the things that's helpful in talking about transitioning to clean vehicles is using phrases like phasing out instead of saying ban. I think sort of generally ban is a word that tends to scare people. And so talking about phasing out or moving away, gradually moving away from diesel powered vehicles and embracing clean vehicles like electric vehicles will help save Illinoisans money, will help save transit agencies money, will relate to that second point here about making our air cleaner to breathe. So lots of benefits to making it through that transition. But there's some words and phrases there that are most helpful when talking about that. And then couldn't fit it all on one slide, but the last piece here is also relevant across all three of those policy pieces within the CETA package. So this one is around climate pollution. So as Amy mentioned, transportation is Illinois' biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And by investing in both public transportation and active modes of transportation, like walking, wheelchair, biking, all that infrastructure, while also electrifying cars and trucks, we can mitigate the air and climate pollution that is harming our community's health and harming our planet. So that's the fourth main message here that we want to be communicating about the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act. And then lastly, like I said, wanted to include some words and phrases that are helpful as we are communicating about these issues. So like I said, these are phrases that have polled well. So just a couple of things that jump out: freedom of mobility, the words vibrant, livable, connected when we're talking about our communities and the communities that we're hoping to create across Illinois. Talking about how increasing our transportation choices helps us have more freedom of mobility, gives us greater independence to be able to access those amenities, access those opportunities, access jobs, get to our doctor's appointments easily and quickly and safely. Those are messages and phrases that do really well. And then clean cars and clean vehicles tends to perform better than using the words electric vehicles. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about these bills. And then the word upgrade. Everyone just loves to upgrade their lives. And so talking about the ways in which improving our transportation across the whole state by upgrading the way that we are able to move is a message that's powerful as well. So that is some of the key message guidance that I wanted to share. Let me stop sharing my screen for a sec. Let's see if there's a great question from Laura. Is it better to try to only stick to one idea in an LTE, health versus accessibility versus safety of transportation, et cetera? Also, is the metro system part of CETA? Two great questions. I'll answer the first. So one of my recommendations about writing an LTE is, yes, to be as specific as possible, usually because you only have so many words. So like I said, LTEs are the shorter form of opinion articles. So op-eds, which I know I referenced a couple of times this evening, those are longer form articles. Happy to talk about those at some point as well. But LTEs tend to be shorter. So like I said, oftentimes publications will have space limitations. So they'll require that you only be 300 words. And so when you're thinking about what you're writing, you want to make your point stick as concisely as possible. And so if you're responding to an article that's written, or if you are responding to, whatever news happens in the spring legislative session, for example, you want to try to stick the landing on the point that you're trying to make. And yeah, be as concise as possible. So if you are submitting an LTE that's broad support for a piece of legislation, especially legislation, honestly, as broad as the whole CETA package is, you can certainly list, a sort of a listicle of reasons why you support it. If you're just doing sort of a general message of support about the legislation. But if you're responding to a specific article, or if you're responding to a specific piece of news that happens in the coming months, I would recommend being as specific as possible in the LTE that you write in response. I can also answer the second question, which is that yes, the metro system is part of the 4 transit agencies that are included in our Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act legislation. So the 4 are the CTA, which is the Chicago Transit Authority, the RTA, which is the Regional Transportation Authority, the Metra, and PACE as well. Anything to add, Amy?
No, that was great. Zach has another good question.
Awesome.
He wants to know, are there pros and cons to writing in as a citizen or as a professional with expertise?
That's a great question. I have sort of a nuanced answer to that, which is, I guess also that's a pros and cons list. So I think that's fine. I would say op-eds are often the more formal version of an LTE. So when we are coordinating op-eds, for example, as part of our campaign effort, we will often figure out who the best author is based on their expertise or their profession or their background. So whether that's, this message needs to come from a legislator, or this message needs to come from a leader within a transit agency, or someone who's driven a CTA bus and worked for the CTA. Oftentimes those pieces are most impactful coming from specific folks with specific backgrounds. With LTEs though, I think that like I said, one of the reasons that LTEs are so popular and so widely read is because they are personal, and because it's often members of your own community submitting them. And so I personally really like when folks write LTEs and they're really personal stories. Like some of the best LTEs I've seen are ones that come from moms and ones that come from students also, like students talking about why they need Illinois to act on climate, for example, is really impactful. And students don't have, a technical background or professional expertise yet per se, but their voices matter and are often very moving. So I think there's an emotional tie here that is part of why LTEs are so impactful. And because of that, writing just as a concerned citizen or activist in your local community is sometimes even better than writing as a professional, because you're just a human who cares and wants the best for your community or your state. And hopefully your neighbors and other members of your community will feel similarly, be moved to action themselves, or will want to join you in the fight. Great question. Laura says, do you have a list of publications for us beyond just the Trib? Another great question. So it sounds like there's some folks here who live in Chicago, which is great. So happy to share options for publications in the city that will print LTEs. I'll just circle back quickly to my note about making sure that you read the instructions of any publication so that you're following their requirements. It's good to just do some quick research, and it's usually very easy to find. You can Google search like Edwardsville Intelligencer, for example, LTEs and or opinion, and you'll find how to submit on their websites. Oftentimes it's just an email address that you will send your LTE to with whatever additional requirements they ask for. Sometimes it's like an online form that they'll have you fill out. But almost all publications have information on their websites about how to submit. And the note that I'll add here is that oftentimes those smaller local papers are extra impactful, sort of in relation to my answer to Zach's question, because those are widely read in local communities or smaller communities. The Tribune certainly has a wide readership. The Chicago Sun-Times has a wide readership. But some of the smaller papers that people read while they're drinking their coffee every single morning are actually the ones that we want LTEs written in, because they might catch people's attention a little bit more than the LTE that publishes, or sorry, the publication that publishes 20 LTEs every single day. So I recommend, like, if you get newspapers delivered to your house or apartment, or if there's outlets that you subscribe to, checking to see if they will accept and print LTEs, and doing some of that sort of local research yourself. And then if you can't find any, happy to share lists of places that will accept them across the state as well. Any other questions? All right. Feel free to add more questions in the chat as they come to you, but I will move us along. I wanted to make sure we take some time for quick action before we do some personal writing time. And I have 2 quick actions that folks can take beyond just writing an LTE this evening. So the first is we have an action alert that folks can fill out that will send a message directly to your state lawmakers, urging them to support the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act. So it's really easy. I'll put the link in the chat, and you can click this link. I'll add it right now. And send a message to your legislators. You can personalize it as well. So there's template language about why they should support the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act, but you can add your own personal message to it as well, and share your reasons for why you as their constituent want them to act. And then the second is very fun, and I hope some of you are able to join us. We are hosting a lobby day in the January, what's called lame duck legislative session. So this is the very short legislative session that happens just before the next session of lawmakers is inaugurated on January 8th. So the session will run from January 1st or 2nd, I believe, through January 7th. We are doing our lobby day on January 7th, so that last day of the legislative session. It is a like 3 to 4 hour event, essentially. If you haven't done a lobby day with IEC or within our coalition space before, they're really fun. I know Amy has participated. I think Virginia, who's on the line as well, has participated. So hopefully they will share how fun they are. But basically, we coordinate transportation to get as many folks as possible to Springfield, to our state capitol building, as possible, all on one day, so that we can take collective action together in support of a policy or policies that we're advocating for. So in this case, we will be advocating for several pieces of legislation on January 7th, one of which is the Clean and Equitable Transportation Act. We are also going to be advocating for legislation that supports our power sector. And then we will also be advocating for legislation that supports accelerating the movement towards cleaner buildings in Illinois and cleaning up the indoor air pollution and emissions that are the result of burning methane gas in our buildings. So those 3 pieces of legislation is what we will be advocating for. We train folks ahead of time. So if you're like, I've never lobbied my legislator before, not sure what this is about, we will make sure that you are confident. And honestly, it's a lot of fun. We will have a rally as part of the day as well. So you'll wear a button that makes sure we all signify, despite our winter coats, that we are together as a movement. We will have some speakers, and we will rally in the rotunda. So don't worry, I know it's on January 7th, but it is inside. And then we will coordinate meetings with your lawmakers. So if you've never done that before, you will get matched with a lobby captain to make sure that you feel confident. But basically, it's your opportunity to advocate for the policies that you care about. with your legislators. So if you've never done that before, it's a great opportunity to do so in an environment where you're super supported, and we'll have team members with you to make it very easy. We'd love to have as many folks as possible. I will put the link to register for the lobby day in the chat as well. RSVP. There you go. We'd love to have you all. It looks like Virginia is going to be joining us. That's awesome. Any questions about those two quick actions? And then we can do some writing. All right, awesome. I'm going to stop or pause the recording.